Tonight's author, Richard Moe, has been committed to keeping the past alive long before he ever wrote a book. After serving as senior advisor to President Jimmy Carter and serving as chief of staff to Vice President Walter Mondale, Mr. Moe was president of the National Trust for Historic Preservation from 1993 to 2010. During his tenure, he worked to preserve and maintain such hallowed landmarks as Manassas National Battlefield and the historic districts of New Orleans after Hurricane Katrina. Mr. Moe's first book, The Last Full Measure, The Life and Death of the First Minnesota Volunteers, was the story of men who gave their lives in defense of a cause they believed in. His second book, Roosevelt's Second Act, is also concerned with a man whose commitment to the cause of freedom ended up costing him his life. The period covered in Mr. Moe's book, the end of FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt's second term in office, and the election of 1940, was a time more perilous than when he was first elected in 1932. Sure, the Great Recession was ebbing, but there was the threat of global war abroad and the staunch opposition of isolationists at home. It was a tough road to hoe, but the American Sphinx, as FDR was nicknamed, triumphed with the kind of political genius and chutzpah that only comes once a generation. It is to our great benefit that we have Mr. Moe's skills as a researcher and gifts as a storyteller to bring such turbulent times roaring back to life. Will you all please join me in introducing Mr. Richard Moe?
Always helps to have my remarks, I've discovered. Thank you very much for that kind introduction. It's great to be here at Politics and Prose. I love this bookstore. It's a great bookstore, but it's also a central part of this community. I can't imagine Washington without independent bookstores, and especially without this independent bookstore. So thank you for coming for that reason also. I have been very fortunate to fall heir to an idea that has not been written about extensively. And that is the question of how FDR and how he decided and why he decided to run for a third term in 1940, an unprecedented third term. I have always been fascinated by FDR. When I first got involved in Minnesota Democratic Farmer Labor politics, he was still very much a presence. My political mentors were Hubert Humphrey and Walter Mondale, who were heavily influenced by FDR. I'd go to union halls, there were posters of FDR. I'm sorry, I will speak up. He was everywhere. He was ubiquitous, and I was very interested in him. I have always been fascinated by presidential history, and particularly by presidential decision-making. And that's really what this book is all about. I didn't really understand him, though, until I started researching this book. And I found out that he was a very complicated man. And nobody saw that more clearly than Francis Perkins, who is one of the great under-recognized people in American political life. First cabinet member, first female cabinet member in the United States, Secretary of Labor, had known FDR for 30 years by the time 1940 came around. And here's what she had to say after his death about FDR. Franklin Roosevelt was not a simple man. That quality of simplicity, which we delight to think marks the great and noble, was not his. He was the most complicated human being I ever knew. And out of this complicated nature, there sprang much of the drive which brought achievement. It made it possible for him to have insight and imagination into the most varied human experiences. And this he applied to the physical, social, geographical, economic, and strategic circumstances thrust upon him as the responsibilities of his time. So, thousands of books have been written about FDR. Why do we need another one? You're here to find out, and I'm here to tell you. Almost everything that's been written about FDR has been written about either the New Deal years or the war years. There has been virtually nothing written about the connective tissue between those two epical achievements. And I have been trying very hard to get into his head, which is not an easy thing to do for reasons I'll explain, to try to understand this decision-making process and how he went about it. Of course, he wrote no memoir because he didn't survive his presidency. and he was not always candid with associates. So it's no easy task to get into FDR's head. Let me set the scene in September of 1939. FDR had won a huge landslide re-election in 1936. But as soon as it was over, he ran afoul of the Congress. He sent up an ill-designed court packing plan, what was called a court packing plan. It was smacked down. He took his foot off the economic accelerator. 2 million more people joined the unemployment rolls. We were in the Roosevelt recession. And, excuse me just a second. And in the 1938 election, he tried to purge the recalcitrant conservative Democrats who wouldn't support his New Deal programs. And he failed miserably at that. So he was at a very low ebb politically. He was probably at the lowest point of his political standing during his entire presidency. He had planned to retire at the end of his second term, as most presidents do plan to retire at the end of their second term. There's no question about this. He had designed and was now building the first presidential library in the country at Hyde Park. That was going to be his retirement headquarters. He built a retreat up there. He was shipping up boxes of files and artifacts every time he went back to Hyde Park. He signed a lucrative contract with Collier's magazine to write regular articles. His mind was set on rebuilding his financial base and enjoying retirement. There were some third-term rumbles, some speculation about whether or not he was going to run for a third term, but nobody, including Roosevelt, paid very serious attention to it. Then on September 1st, 1939, Hitler invaded Poland. Hitler had already consumed the Rhineland, Austria, the Sudetenland, the rest of Czechoslovakia, and this was too much for the very elastic policy of appeasement, even as far as the British and the French were concerned. And they had announced that if Hitler invaded Poland, they would come to Poland's defense. Well, Hitler invaded Poland, and Britain and France declared war on Germany. But it wasn't a real war. It came to be known as the phony war. It was a standoff in Western Europe. So for about 8 or 9 months, they stood across trenches looking at each other, but without fighting. FDR, with war looming on the horizon, he was convinced there would be a war, and he was convinced ultimately that the war would come to the United States. He did not have a lot of support in that view, but he was convinced of it. And he struggled to find a way to help Britain and France. Excuse me. They needed the materiel, the arms, to withstand the aggression of Hitler, and only the United States had the industrial capacity to provide it. But in the way was the Neutrality Act, which prevented aid to belligerents of any kind, and FDR sought to change that. He ultimately did, but it was not easy. But the country was very heavily isolationist. It's hard to imagine now, but the country was not engaged in the world as it is now. It is not, and people saw World War I perhaps being repeated. And a lot of Americans thought that it was a fool's errand for America to get engaged in World War I. They didn't think we had any business over there. The Europeans didn't repay their war debts. There was no good to be had from getting involved in another war. Nonetheless, despite this heavily isolationist strain in the Congress and in the country, FDR struggled to find a way to get aid to Britain and France. And sometimes he did it surreptitiously, and sometimes he got caught at it and became public. But he shaped this policy of trying to aid the Allies all by himself. And this is where it really gets interesting in contrasting it with today. There was no National Security Council. As a matter of fact, there was no White House staff that dealt with substantive issues. All he had were some cabinet departments, and in this case, the State Department, for which he had little regard. So he did all this himself in his head, nor did he have a formal intelligence apparatus. There was nothing resembling the CIA or even the OSS, which wouldn't come for a year or so. So his intelligence gathering, as often as not, would consist of interviewing returning Harvard classmates to find out what they saw and heard when they were in Europe. It was very ad hoc and very anecdotal. He made it work for him. Nonetheless, during all this time, there was growing pressure on him to state whether he intended to run for a third term. And as you know, there had been a third term taboo. No president had ever successfully run for a third term. Only two had tried seriously, Ulysses Grant and his hero, FDR's hero, Teddy Roosevelt, and neither succeeded. So it was a big issue, and the press kept asking him what his intentions were, and he would not say. If the press asked him the question, he would say, "Put on a dunce cap and go stand in the corner. Not going to address that." And he got away with that. And at the Gridiron Dinner in December of 1939, the press relentlessly went after him on this question, and they wheeled out a great big 8-foot-tall papier-mâché sphinx. And nobody laughed harder than FDR, and it is now part of the FDR Museum at Hyde Park. So there are two major storylines here. There's war in Europe, and will he run? And these two storylines are inextricably intertwined, and they remain so for most of this story. The real war begins in May of 1940, when Hitler invades the Low Countries and France. France very quickly falls. Britain is hanging by a thread. There is every reason to believe that Hitler is going to invade the British Isles, and in fact, he issues an order to that effect at one point. And it's everybody's assumption, including Roosevelt's, that Britain could go down. But he, nonetheless, does everything he can to bolster the United Kingdom at that point. Let me talk a bit about FDR's decision-making process, because that's really what's at the core of this book. Many assumed that he was always running. Excuse me. But that's not true. I don't believe it's true. There's no evidence to suggest that this was inevitable. There is nothing inevitable about this decision. And he made the decision entirely alone. This is an incredible fact. From September till of 39 until right before the convention in July of 40, there's no evidence that he talked to another human being about this issue. No one. And this was typical of his decision-making process on major decisions. He always needed people around him, but he was a very solitary person. You know, he grew up as an only child on a remote site in upstate New York, few friends, became very self-reliant. And that self-reliance became one of his defining characteristics throughout his life and certainly throughout his presidency. And again, he made this decision alone, did it without ever having spoken with anyone, and he always waited until the last minute to make these decisions. He reasoned that I will get more information if I wait, if I have the opportunity. So he never made a decision until he had to. So what did I learn about FDR, which could fill volumes all by itself? As I mentioned, he was a famously social person. He loved to have people around him all the time, even if it was a tense situation, and maybe especially if it was a tense situation. He just loved the vitality of people around him all the time. And yet he was a loner. His wife Eleanor said, he had no confidence, not even me. And that's true. I'm hard-pressed to identify anyone in whom he confided on major issues such as this. Robert Sherwood, a Pulitzer Prize-winning playwright, brilliant writer, became a speechwriter for FDR during this period of 1940. And he wrote a classic biography of Roosevelt and Hopkins. It's a great biography, now complemented, I'm happy to say, by another biography of Harry Hopkins called The Hopkins Touch by David Rohl, which is worth reading if you're really fascinated by this man, and he is a fascinating man. What Sherwood said about Roosevelt was he has a thickly forested interior. Just think about that. A thickly forested interior. And he didn't want anyone to penetrate that forest, and they didn't. That was his defining characteristic. There was also a duality to Roosevelt that I found, and again, during this episode, it was very much in evidence. He was a bold and perceptive and prescient and I think a moral statesman. He set lofty goals, very principled goals for the country. And yet in pursuit of those goals, he could be cautious, ambitious, sometimes arrogant, manipulative, and perhaps even duplicitous sometimes. So this is one of the contradictions of FDR that we see and that Francis Perkins was talking about. 4 days before the convention opened on July 15th, 1940, this was on July 11th, FDR was swearing in Frank Knox as the new Secretary of the Navy. Felix Frankfurter had come down from the Supreme Court to preside over this and to officiate. And he asked Frankfurter to return to the White House that evening to discuss a very important matter. Roosevelt and Frankfurter spent 2 hours in the Oval study upstairs in the residence of the White House, not to be confused with the Oval Office. The Oval study was adjacent to his bedroom, Roosevelt's favorite room in the entire White House, where he spent most of his time. And they spent 2 hours discussing this issue. It was the first time Roosevelt had ever talked with anybody about the question of his running again. Nobody knows what was said, no record of it. But at the end of it, Roosevelt asked Frankfurter to please write a memo, draft a memo, and bring it to him immediately, incorporating what he had just said. Frankfurter said he would, but he said he would also like to request a memo from Archibald MacLeish, then the Librarian of Congress, who was appointed to that position by Roosevelt. Now, just picture this. Here's the President of the United States deciding whether to run, whether he is justified in running for an unprecedented third term. And he is seeking advice from a Supreme Court justice who is not a politician, and from a poet who happens to be the Librarian of Congress. This is truly FDR's way. I mean, it's very unique. But these two memos, which I've come by, offer, I think, the surest and clearest window into FDR's mind at this point on this question. And I think they are so important that I had them reprinted in their entirety as an index in this book. So he decided to run because of the war. He saw war coming to the United States, ultimately. He knew that the country wasn't ready for it. He had to prepare the country for war, and he had to bolster Great Britain to stand in Hitler's way in the meantime. And he thought that only he could do that. He looked around for another Democrat who would support his foreign and domestic policies, and who could win the election. That was no small order, because Wendell Wilkie had been nominated, and he was a very attractive candidate at this point. He couldn't find anybody, so he decided that he had to run, and it was the war that was the deciding factor. And this set the stage for a very dramatic convention in Chicago. I'm not going to tell you what happened because you have to buy the book and read it and find out. But it was very dramatic. A lot happened, some of it planned, most of it unplanned, and filled with drama. This story contains a fascinating set of characters and relationships. I've talked a bit about Frances Perkins. She engineered something at the convention with Eleanor Roosevelt that saved Roosevelt from himself. He was full of arrogance at that convention, and he was on the verge of making a huge, huge mistake that would have ended in disaster for everybody. And they came together and prevented it. This was a time when women were not at the table politically, but they did it. They pulled it off, and it was remarkable feat. And I really so admire what they did. And in doing so, they kind of paved the way for women to play a more full role in political affairs. Charles A. Lindbergh, he plays a prominent role because he was, of course, the leader of the isolationist movement in the United States. They only met once, and they kind of danced around each other. It was a very cordial meeting. They didn't like each other at all. Roosevelt told told a colleague he thought Lindbergh was a Nazi. Well, he was not a Nazi, but he was very cozy with the Nazis when he was over in Germany. But the real surprise of the book is Wendell Wilkie, who is, in my view, almost as much of a hero in this book as Franklin Roosevelt. Wendell Wilkie was a utility executive who had been, up until a year before the Republican convention, a Democrat. He was a New Dealer. He was an internationalist. He was almost a duplicate of Franklin Delano Roosevelt. But he was running for the Republican nomination, and he was catching fire because his opposition, Tom Dewey, Robert A. Taft, Arthur Vandenberg, they were kind of the old Mossback Republicans, the old style. And he presented a huge contrast. And people saw war coming, and they wanted somebody who thought differently. And he came from nowhere to win the nomination of the Republican Party in June of 1940. There was great resentment at that convention in Philadelphia that he was, on the part of many, that he had only recently been a Democrat. And this is exemplified by an encounter, a random encounter that he had in a hotel lobby with a former senator from Indiana. The senator said, "Wendell, you're not my kind of Republican." And Wilkie said, "Well, it's true, Senator. I was a Democrat for a while, but now I'm a Republican." Senator said, "Well, Wendell, back in Indiana, we invite the town whore into church, but we don't let her lead the choir the first evening." There was nervous laughter around, but there was a serious point being made. But where Wendell Wilkie really soared, I think, and really distinguished himself was after the election. The election, as you'll hear, was very tight. But he lost, and he lost very graciously. And the mandate of the election was Lend-Lease. This was FDR's plan to give the president extraordinary powers to send aid to countries all over the world that were fighting aggression. And it made the United States the great arsenal of democracy during World War II, a huge effort. The Republican leadership opposed it. Wendell Wilkie said, "This is a matter of principle for me." They had a wonderful dinner the night before Roosevelt's third inaugural. Roosevelt gave him a note to send to Churchill, to take to Churchill. He went to London, he came back, he testified on the Hill, and in Roosevelt's view, he made the difference in passing Lend-Lease, and he never forgot it. And in doing so, he incurred an enormous political risk because he alienated the base of the Republican Party. And probably, even though he died before the convention, before the election of 1944, he probably ruined his chances of ever holding that nomination because of what he did with Lend-Lease. An act of great statesmanship, the kind of statesmanship we would like to see more of today. Winston Churchill. Churchill and Roosevelt had only met once. They had met at a dinner in London in 1918 during World War I. Churchill never remembered the encounter. Roosevelt never forgot the fact that Churchill never remembered the encounter. But Churchill was arduously courting Roosevelt because he needed the help of the United States to survive, and Roosevelt was trying to give it. And what Churchill needed desperately were some World War I era destroyers to replace those being sunk by U-boats in Great Britain and the English Channel almost daily. And it's a long, complicated story, but they worked out a way to send the destroyers to Britain without seeking the approval of Congress. That was a very unusual thing, but he did it. Second, third-term presidents learned how to do things without Congress, and he kind of paved the way there. But there was an issue as to, but they had to be traded in return for something to satisfy U.S. law, and they had to be traded for access to British bases in the Caribbean and elsewhere in the Western Hemisphere, and that was to satisfy U.S. law. Well, Churchill was worried that Roosevelt was going to couch the thing in such terms that he would be getting the better of the bargain, and he didn't want that impression to reach London, obviously. So they couldn't work it out. So Roosevelt arranged a transatlantic conference call, and he put his Attorney General, Robert Jackson, on the phone. And Jackson tried to describe to Churchill the exigencies of U.S. law and why this had to be a trade, or as he said, it had to be a bargain. And Churchill said, empires just don't bargain. And Robert Jackson, the Attorney General, said, well, republics do. Roosevelt, to try to calm the waters here a little bit, said, you see, Winston, the trouble is I have an Attorney General, and he says I have to bargain. Well, said Churchill, maybe you ought to trade these destroyers for a new Attorney General. Anyway, they worked it out and they got the destroyers over there. In the general election, FDR began to campaign more as commander-in-chief than as a candidate, the Democratic nominee. He visited defense plants, army bases, and so forth. It was kind of a variation of come to be called the Rose Garden strategy. But Wilkie smoked him out. Wilkie ultimately made war the issue, a huge issue. The polls began to close, and FDR had to come out of his cocoon and campaign arduously for the last 2 weeks of the campaign. He made 5 very dramatic speeches, all on the eastern seaboard. On election night, Roosevelt thought he was going to lose. The polls had tightened dramatically. He was receiving the returns, as he always did, in the dining room of the big house at Hyde Park, and he saw something in the early returns that really troubled him. He turned to a Secret Service agent. He said, Mike, close that door. I don't want to see anybody. The Secret Service agent said, even your family? I said anybody. And the door was closed. That agent, Mike Riley, said he had never seen the president lose his nerve, but he was sweating and he had lost his nerve. He thought he was going to lose. Well, as we know, that moment passed, and he was reelected. And what consequences that reelection had, not just immediately, but long term. Most immediately, it put in place a man of extraordinary talent and experience to lead this country through World War II and beyond, and to help shape the world beyond World War II. It began the eclipse of isolationism, because after this point, after the war, the United States, for better or worse, would be engaged with the rest of the world, and still is. This election, because of the destroyer deal and the Lend-Lease arrangement, planted the seeds for the national security state that we are today. And it changed the way we think about the presidency. Never again would a presidential candidate succeed without passing that threshold test. Is he able to understand foreign policy and protect the interests of the American people in dealings abroad? Therefore, I think this is one of the most consequential elections in American history. It's right up there with 1864, when Lincoln ran for re-election during the Civil War. I think it was every bit as important. We will, of course, never fully understand what was in FDR's mind when he was thinking about during this time, but this book is simply my own effort to try to penetrate that thickly forested interior that Robert Sherwood talked about. Thank you.